Hi, Malcolm. Welcome to my country. I hope you like it. This thing that you said about, like I've read, you've said that emotion is contagious. And from there, I come to these spontaneous revolutions that happen and are now happening a lot here. They have become a bit like YouTube hits, It's like one summer, everybody's singing Katy Perry, and then 3 years later, you don't know who she is. And I think that this persistence, there's no, how do you, now I'm just wondering what am I supposed to ask you? I'm just saying, how does one infect these things with more ideology so that there is some aftertaste after the summer is over,
Yeah, this is the great question. So I think it's a mistake to view hierarchical type protest movements and network type protest movements as being fundamentally incompatible. I think what you're asking is there a way to fuse them, to have a little bit of the best of both? Because what was so extraordinarily powerful about Arab Spring was exactly what you're talking about.
Like it makes great TV.
But it's more than that, though. It represented emotion in the moment, and that kind of spontaneity is what allowed these extraordinary things to happen. That's what Mubarak saw that told him he had to go, right? He saw that kind of anger coming from a place where he never thought it would come, and he was hit by the emotional force of that. Right? And so I don't mean to, in any way, to disparage the power of that kind of immediate contagion and spontaneity. But that needs to be married to something. And unfortunately, I think the hierarchy has to come first. That these revolutions work when there is that outpouring of spontaneous emotion, and it's able to be anchored by some kind of formal organization that can use it and channel it and see it through. So to go back to the example of the civil rights movement in the United States, there were very, very clearly moments, YouTube moments. There was one day in Birmingham where every single journalist from all around the world was there to record an extraordinary outpouring of anger and emotion and transformation, but that was preceded by years of planning. And it's that notion that what we have been given with some of the new tools of social media is the ability to finish revolutions and not start them. That's, I think, the key learning.
Thank you. I think gentleman back there, yeah.
Hi, my name is Nikhil. I'm an entrepreneur. I enjoyed your speech when you talked about the impact, the network model's impact on social fabric. My question is, what is the impact of the networked model on business? Because by definition, a business or an organization is hierarchical. So is there a negative impact or a positive impact, or is there both?
Yeah. I think that what you're seeing in the business world is a hybrid model now, that many of the most successful organizations are hierarchies embedded in networks. It was really the Japanese who kind of pioneered this notion in the way they transformed their automobile industry, where they would have a small central hierarchy which did things like design the cars, direct R&D, direct marketing. But their supplier network was a complete, almost self-organizing network. There's a famous case study of a fire at a critical components factory that affected Toyota in the 80s. And everyone thought that Toyota would have to shut down its plants for months. And they ended up shutting them down for like 2 days. And it was because they had this highly resilient, self-learning, evolving network around them that allowed them to have the very best of the network model with a hierarchy in the middle. Apple, this is what Apple is. Apple is almost a medieval hierarchy at the center, right? With until he died, a king, a monarch at the top, right? Who ruled his country like a, like the worst kind of despot from the Middle Ages. And then surrounding Apple, though, was this incredibly fertile, spontaneous network that spanned the whole world, right? He was using suppliers from everywhere and letting them solve their own problems. And so that's the way I think, I almost feel like the business world has figured out in advance of the rest of us about how to bring these two models together. I wish we were all in the social realm were as sophisticated as some of the people in the business world.
I'll defer to hierarchy and ask Kali Puri.
I want to go back to the idea of disadvantage and advantage that you brought up. India and China are always compared, and our political system in India is always touted as an advantage. But looking at the progress in China, I'm wondering whether democracy really is that much of an advantage.
It's funny, as someone who is neither Indian nor Chinese, I have some objectivity on this matter. If I had to pick, if I was forced tomorrow to move to one of those two countries or to bet all of my life savings and the future of my family in one of these two countries, I would, without hesitation, choose India.
Round of applause, please.
Not even. No, I'm not saying this because I'm here. Let me explain why. I'm not merely currying favor with you. Because I had a fascinating conversation with someone who spent a lot of time in China, actually just last week. And the problem with the Chinese system is that the government at the center has no legitimacy. And this is something I spent a lot of time on in my new book, actually. The problem of legitimacy is the single central problem that afflicts any kind of social organization, political, social, economic organization. They have none. What you saw last night on the stage, that kind of open discussion about what's right and wrong with your country, that's about legitimacy. You can gather people from every corner of every party and ideological affiliation in one room, and they don't kill each other, and they have a discussion. It's spirited, it's, at times you roll your eyes, but that's about how everyone has a chance to talk about what the future of the country needs to be or ought to be and be taken and be heard, right? You could not have that discussion in China. Impossible. And for that reason, and that reason alone, I think that this society has a far better chance of making a long-term success of itself than China does. China can collapse tomorrow. The legitimacy problem is so serious. This country cannot collapse tomorrow, right? No more so than Norway can, or Canada can, or any other country that has a deep-rooted tradition of legitimate democracy on which to build from.
Thank you. That gentleman back there who's been raising his hands for the last half an hour.
Hi, Malcolm. So my question is for a research that I'm working on called 1988, which I think is the tipping point in India, which transformed youth behavior. So one of the key insights that we got is that our generation, which I'm a part of, lacks a superhero, one unified leader that we can look up to, like a Martin Luther King or a Gandhi. So do you think that as a solution to problems now, whether political or economic, is it to have one leader or to have the fragmented network, like you have a spiritual guru and you have a Bollywood guy and then you have a business guy? What do you think?
Well, I don't think that it's realistic or even useful in complex modern democracies to think you can replicate something like a Martin Luther King or a Fidel Castro, or you don't really want that, right? Those were organizations that were social hierarchies that were created to fulfill very, very specific functions, or at least in the case of Martin Luther King was, that he had a very, very clear set of goals, and when he accomplished those set of goals, his organization essentially went away, right? I mean, he was shot, but it was in the process of going away. In those kinds of instances where we have a very specific goal in mind, I like the hierarchy. For multidimensional, complex societies and problems, I don't think you can have that. I think what you need is something closer, much more closely to the kind of hybrid that I was talking about earlier. I mean, yeah, I think that that's a much more realistic model for.
Are you planning to be here for dinner tonight? Just a joke. Yeah, this.
Hi, I'm Rajiv Bajaj from representing Entrepreneurs Organization, New Delhi. Malcolm, you like to have conversations. So from your short time you've had in India so far, and conversations you've had with Indian business people, entrepreneurs, how do you find us different from our peers in the West? What patterns do you see?
Oh, that's an interesting question. How do I find you different from? Well, in a certain sense, I don't find entrepreneurs here or anywhere else different at all. I mean, I think that the kind of traits that it takes to successfully see an idea through to completion aren't culturally specific. They're the kind of daring and imagination and perseverance and conscientiousness. Those are character traits that are above national character traits. There are ways in which individual cultures shape the sort of shape the curve of the learning process. So what I think, for example, that, and I'm only being half facetious when I say this, that one of the reasons that Indians have done so well in Silicon Valley is if you can make it in India, then Silicon Valley is a breeze, right? I mean, everything works, you know, there's no problem. So it's just like, so there is a kind of, there can be an enormous advantage to being trained in a much more challenging environment, right? When you, it's the same reason why Israelis do so well in Silicon Valley. There's tons and tons and tons of Israelis in software world, right? And if you've made it in Israel, where you have a threat of being blown up every day, then you come to America and you think, good Lord, this is as easy as it gets, right? So there is that kind of, their learning curve might be a little bit steeper. But an entrepreneur is an entrepreneur is an entrepreneur, regardless of where they come from.
Gentleman there.
Malcolm, thank you very much for a very interesting address, and you explained about leadership, strategy, and discipline, and how these three factors ultimately made Gandhi or Mandela or even Martin Luther King a great success. And then you also analyzed why Arab Spring was not successful and what were. In that context, have you studied or can you predict the likely success or failure of anti-corruption movement in India? And what will be the 2 or 3 critical success factors to make it happen?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I obviously don't know nearly as much about that topic as all of you. But you know, the thing about, I would just say that when it comes to looking at things like anti-corruption campaigns, that my bias would be that there has to be as much movement from within as without. That so much about the fight against ingrained practices and habits like corruption. And remember, corruption is fundamentally a habit. It's not a spiritual condition. That all human beings, regardless of what culture they belong to, will resort to, not all of them, but many, will resort to corrupt practices under certain circumstances. We have seen corruption in almost every culture, country, system in the world at one point in its history or another, right? So it's wrong to think of it as something that is specific to the spirit or the nature of a particular culture. Or it's something that arises in dysfunctional organizations, right? So part of me says that let's not forget that part of the solution to any ingrained problem of corruption is technical. It's building systems that are more transparent, and that set up successful cascades of better behavior. So the norm is not to take the bribe. The norm is not to take the bribe, right? The norm is, yes. So that's our, so that there is a tendency, I think, to overly moralize the fight against corruption. And that's not inappropriate, but we have to remember that, look, it's about building these kinds of very, very nuts and bolts, prosaic systems that make it really, really hard to deviate from the way you're supposed to do things. And so I think that the long-term solution is when you have that technocratic spirit coming from the middle, from the center, that joins forces with the kind of moral force on the outside.
Malcolm, thank you very much. Actually, there are a lot of people raising their hands, but I think my minders have told me to wrap this up. So we'll wrap it up. I think that was wonderful. We really enjoyed your session. Great thing. And I think we're all eagerly awaiting your new book, David and Goliath, when it hits the stands. Thank you.